The reality is you are the person you are. I don't think, in my experience, money makes you more or less happy. For some people, it creates more problems. So this whole thing, I think, is just about knowing yourself, doing what makes you comfortable, doing what interests you. But if you're internally messed up or something's going on, money isn't going to fix it.
Welcome to the American Dream Builder and Investor podcast, where our vision is to inspire busy professionals, especially first and second generation immigrants and Americans, to explore the state of the American dream in 2022 and beyond. That is the Trinity of freedom: time, financial, and geography freedom. I'm your host, Missy Liu, and I have achieved financial independence, and I'm helping many others to do the same. I started out with $5,000 and have really built wealth for my family along the process. Now I'm on a mission to help hundreds of thousands of people like me to do the same.
Hey there, welcome to the American Dream Builder and Investor podcast again. I'm your host, Missy Liu. Today we have a special guest. His name is Cairns, and he is also a retail executive with more than 25 years of experiences in the merch ops and supply chain area. He's actually an Aussie that moved to the US in 2016-2017 timeframe. And now he's working for the Fortune 1 company. And we all know what that is. And he's currently married to teenage girls that he and his wife has. And he's a huge Tennessee Titans fan. I've been hearing him talking a lot about it as well, even before the podcast. So in this podcast episode, we'll dive into how he invested in the real estate while he was overseas in Australia, and how he naturally and organically grew his real estate portfolio and his diversification into the real estate space while he's growing his career. And you'll also hear about how his nonchalant and laid-back personality has helped him look at investment and life in such a positive way. So I can't wait to dive into the episode with you. Welcome, Adam. Is there anything you'd like to cover that I might have missed in your bio?
Yeah, Macy, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the chat. Nothing else really to share. I think we'll probably cover it in our chat. I think what I will say is when I reflect back on where we are now, I never thought that we would be here. Very humble beginnings. So it's been quite the ride and I'm enjoying every minute.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, there's definitely many pieces to love to dive into. Now you're executive at one of the Fortune 1 company, and even before that in Australia, you were an executive as well. However, when it comes to building the freedom, the financial piece and freedom, time, geography, etc., I know that some people, they're just tied to their job. They can be making really hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, but just tied to their job and not having any of those freedom. So walk us through, what have you done today for you and your family in terms of those pieces? And then we can kind of work backwards, like kind of how you got there a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. I guess the summary of where we are today is we've got 3 investment properties, as well as our primary residence, 1 in Australia, 2 in the US. We sold our house in Sydney. We had it as an investment, but then it was a bit of an older house, a big lot, a lot of yard care and things. And we'll probably get into this later, but it really depends on what your personal time and philosophy is when you're property investing. I'm more into townhouses and units because it suits my lifestyle, that I can pay a POA or an HOA fee, a property management fee, and it kind of takes care of itself. But I've got friends who don't work and they have the time to go and do handyman stuff. I don't. So overall, our summary is we've got some managed funds, so a share portfolio, a property investment portfolio with 3 properties, and believe it or not, a little bit of a whiskey portfolio. So that's something recently that caught my attention. The share market wasn't doing great. I wasn't overly interested in the managed fund I had. So I pulled that money out and put it into something I actually find interesting, which I also think is important with investing, and bought a little chunk of whiskey.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. We talked about a portfolio, and it's also interesting. One of the things that on your portfolio is you started investing in the US while you were in Australia. And if I also recall, you didn't come from a family that really did a lot of investing. So what inspired you kind of to take the step of building wealth for you and your family? How did you get into the space?
I think the short answer is I don't really know. I just knew that I always wanted to. I was very curious. I did generally see that people who built more wealth invested in some capacity. So I thought you're better off and get in to learn yourself than rely on someone doing it for you. And as you said, the first property we bought was in Florida. We still have it today. We bought it after the crash. So when the subprime mortgage crisis hit the US hard and the globe in 07, 08, for the first time in a long time, and pretty much the only time since, the Australian dollar was at parity with the US dollar. Far from that today, right? It's like 67 cents or something. So the property we bought was $48,000 back then. This is 2010. So we borrowed the money in Australia, got in touch with a broker who organised bank accounts and things. And we didn't have a lot of cash at the time. So we borrowed the money in Australia and shipped it to the US and bought this property for 48 grand. At the time, I did want to invest, but probably the cheapest unit we could get in and around the broader suburbs of Sydney was about 260. And we didn't have that money. And this was our first foray, right? I didn't want to take on that risk. I didn't know. So despite the distance, I thought we would ship the money to the US and buy something for 48 grand. We actually borrowed 60 and have a bit of a slush fund for repairs and things like that. But we sent it over and we've still got that property today. It's ticking along quite well down there. And it's about 10 minutes from Animal Kingdom in Florida.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I imagine the same place probably quadrupled in values just because they bought it at a really good time. Yeah. So with that property, how did you manage to invest outside the Australia where you lived? Understand there's a currency difference. Did you have to set up a LLC? Because I assume you perhaps also bought it sight unseen, or did you have to fly to the US to do it?
Yeah, it's a good question. We bought it sight unseen. We had photos, but I'm a little bit of an emotional investor. I think property investing, you've got to detach emotionally a little bit. Like, would I live there? No. Would someone? Yes. So sight unseen actually worked for me. And it's just something you've got to weigh up when you're getting into it, right? Like, understand your personality, your risk tolerance, your time investment, and make the right call. So yes, sight unseen, we set up an LLC, so I didn't fly over. But this broker, he was based in Australia and I was going through him for a lot of that setup. But then eventually I lost touch with that guy and I could manage my bank accounts and everything myself. The LLC was relatively easy to set up, but you just learn a lot when you go into property investing as well. Like, I read up on LLCs, I read up on currency transfers and fees, and I didn't even know what an HOA was, right? In Australia, we call it like strata management. Over here, it's POA or HOA. So I actually liked the international flavor of investing as well. I was learning a lot about the US. And when we eventually moved here for work, which is a different story, a lot of expats or foreigners find it very hard to buy a house in the US inside of 2 years because our credit history doesn't carry over to the US financial system. So we didn't have a credit rating, but I was able to borrow against that unit in Florida that we owned outright and use that as equity as down payment on the house that I'm in right now. So we were in the US for 10 days when we moved here in 2016 and put an offer in on this house, which now that I look back on that is completely absurd. But at the time, my wife has never been one for renting, always kind of do the financially wise thing. So using that original Florida condo or unit as collateral for this has also accelerated our overall wealth, I would say, when it comes to what is now our primary residence. So
yeah, it's amazing.
It has opened a door, literally, in a couple of different ways.
It's amazing. What I hear from your story is that taking that first step is critical. Like, you looked at the risks, right? Like, taking a big risk, spend $260,000 for, even though it's in another country, but US has a fairly transparent government system similar to Australia, unlike some other countries, right? So there is some layer of trust that you can build in inherently. And you took that first step. And because of that first step, a lot of people say about real estate and wait. It's exactly what you did. You bought the real estate and you waited, and you're able to leverage that to down payment on the second house within 10 days, right? Coming to this
Yeah.
country. And that's in the last few years as well. And that's amazing. What I also loved about your story is that you leveraged experts as well. Like, you didn't look for off-market properties and et cetera, et cetera. Like you leveraged expert, which is similar to what I do with my investors. Like we work with experts in the commercial real estate space and finding properties and making that first step a little bit easier, getting to understanding how the investment works, what we look at. So it's a hands-off process for our investors. And that kind of resonates with me about how I took my first step with my property as well. And just trusting the experts. I mean, sometimes you have to do a little bit of your due diligence to verify they're not a crook and they're competent. But I
Always.
feel to do a little bit of hands off and learn along the process is so important. Yeah.
Oh, you're right. Like the scariest moments ever I remember is when you wire transfer money, tens of thousands of dollars, and then there's this period where it's out of your Australian bank account and there's nothing for 2 days, and then it finally appears in the US. Like they're scary moments. But of course, I've done it several times now, but I remember the first time, and I don't think I slept. But you do have to trust the process, do your due diligence, and not, I guess, investing as well as your career or life. You've just got to realize you can't do it all yourself. And there are folks out there who are willing to help. You've got to be selective, obviously, but probably the best thing I did was realizing I couldn't do it alone and shouldn't.
Yeah, I think that was kind of the big step for me as well, especially transferring from the residential space to the commercial space. Yeah. So now with you, there's a lot of people, who worked in corporate, like Fortune 1 or consulting career, etc. They get burned out. And for them, and there is actually a few people in the company you work at that talks about the burnout to me personally. And they kind of see real estate as like a way for them to make work optional, right? Just because firing, hiring, economy, all those things are out of the control of us when we work under someone. What are your thoughts about how this fits into the overall, perhaps retirement plan, early retirement plan, freedom plan, and work optional plan?
Yeah. What I like about it is it gives you options. I think if, I know people, who have lost their job, and their big realization is that they were so wedded to their job, not just fiscally, but almost as identity. And it's probably not very healthy, right? And it's that test of, if I got fired tomorrow and I bumped into someone in the street that I worked with, would they say hello? Like, I hope so, right? But some people's job is their identity, and when that's taken away, that's pretty bad, right? So I think for me, it's always been a plan B and safety net. But as my career's progressed, it certainly is an early retirement thing. The move to the US has been very good for us. Australia is very expensive. Wages are good, but like the floor wage is higher, but the ceiling wage isn't as high. I think in the US, there's a bigger chasm between minimum and top money earning. So this has accelerated what we were staring at in Australia, which is a 30-year mortgage and, a little property over in the US, where we've sort of accelerated our retirement plan. Now, what I've found in life, and I'm not super old, but I've been around a little bit, I'm 44 now, is that sometimes the romance of an idea, it's very different to the reality, right? So while I kind of fantasize about playing golf 3 days a week and chilling out, living off my investment income, the reality is I probably can't sit still and I'll get very bored. So I sort of see myself in the next decade or so probably expanding the portfolio of real estate, shares, and who knows, whiskey, and probably doing some kind of business of my own long term, because I'm the kind of personality where I can't sit still for too long. And I just start getting curious and trying things. So I think the way I'd summarize it, Macy, is flexibility. It's there, and it'll aid what I choose to do next in some way, shape, or form. But without it, to your point earlier, it's just you and the job, and I don't think that's a great place to be.
Yeah, understand. Yeah, option is key, especially in today's world when we all have options. I wouldn't say we all, but a lot of us have options to work from anywhere. So how do you want to design your life around what you really want in life versus, working? And I did
Yeah,
it.
that's right.
It's so
That's right.
critical.
I
Yeah.
think what I will say is you go through stages of life, right? And I really applaud you for what you've achieved so far in your investment portfolio. I think perspective is very important in life and in work. And while my job is pretty full on, right, it's quite intense, I always maintain a healthy dose of perspective. Like my sister's a nurse, like that's literally life and death. We did move from Australia to the US, and if it all got taken away tomorrow, the worst case scenario is we go back to Australia because our visas would be revoked. And I'll be very thankful for the time here. So I've always been able to maintain a healthy mental balance at work for whatever reason, especially in retail. I think it can get very intense. And if you don't have a healthy dose of perspective, you're probably in for a limited career in that space. So I don't know if that's personality and me, or it's just a bit of kind of wise perspective these days, but balance is very important, is all I'll say.
Yeah, definitely. And what you just mentioned there is also downside protection. A lot of people are scared to take the first step, whether it's investing, into a single family home or investing into passive investments with syndications like what we do here, because they're worried. They don't know, like they're worried, like, what if this happens? What if that happens? I think just being honest with yourself, being okay, because like whatever decision you make, like there's uncontrollables out there, right? Even though some of the uncontrollables potentially higher risk, higher
Mm-hmm.
probability, some of them may be lower, but be comfortable with you maybe losing the money. I mean, no one wants to lose the money, but they're losing the money, having certain risks. If you're absolutely okay with accepting the worst case scenario, you'll find that, like, if I do fall, I can stand back up. Like, it's not the end of the world. Then you kind of remove the emotions away from it, and etc. And you can actually perform a lot better too, because at least for me, when I'm under stress, I'm not performing to the fullest creativity. But once I understand, like, I mean, the worst case is, I'll do this again, do that again, then you realize that taking that first step has like really good amount of upside, but downside is really capped. And you won't be so disappointed if it does happen because you're prepared mentally. But hopefully, always plan for the worst and wish for the best. So
Yeah. No,
yeah.
I agree. I agree. Like you said the words before, you have to do your due diligence. But I do think having multiple irons in the fire, so to speak, whether it's property investing, your job, family stuff, generally is good for well-rounded balance.
Yeah. And the one thing I did want to kind of go back on is the due diligence piece you mentioned. You have 3 properties now, like you mentioned, and you're making like risky investments, which, sounds more like a hobby, but I'm sure you wouldn't just throw your money around per se. And with all your more than 25 years of retail experiences working as executive in the number 1 Fortune 1 company, how did you go about assessing maybe your first investment? How did you kind of taking that first step? Like, what made you feel comfortable about investment, apart from like it is much cheaper? But what were the key things that you had to check, and how did that change when it comes to a second property or third, etc.?
I did a lot of reading, especially about foreign tax laws. I bought a couple of books on foreign property ownership and tax, 1041 exchanges and all this type of stuff. Relatively boring, right? But I think you have to do it, and you just need to make sure that you don't have to be an expert, but you just need to make sure you're no fool. And for all 3 properties, Macy, in fact, all investments, really, sometimes there's advisors out there and they say, buy this. I recommend you buy this. Everything I've bought has been my call, me and my wife's call. I would rather live and die by my own decisions. And I might have won some more, I might have lost some more, but at least I would rather put my faith in myself when making that call. And, a bit of a gut check, right? So the second property we bought, which was just before we left Australia, we bought a unit in Canberra, which is near a university. And we knew at that point we were leaving for the US, but we knew that we wanted to have some roots in Australia as well. And at that time, we did keep our house in Sydney, which is since sold. But the second one was a different call than the first. The first was we want to learn, we were curious. It was about value, a little bit exciting too. I have since visited the property multiple times, but not until like 2017 or something. Whereas the second one was a different reason. It was maintaining a foothold in Australia, and we were leaving to work here. We didn't think it would last 6 years, which it has currently. We thought we'd be here for 2 or 3, get some experience, go home, and then that would be good for us. But now that's still there ticking away. So there was a different reason for getting into that one. And then the third one really is here where we live in Bentonville. And we just thought it was going to be an area that was going to boom. Bentonville itself is growing quite well, northwest Arkansas. But this particular townhouse is right between the Bentonville Square and where the new Home Office is going to be. And before, this was about 2.5 years ago, before the new Home Office was really getting going, I just thought that corridor would be something to really get excited about. So we had a little bit more money then, but that one was really more upside for us long term. I just thought, we'll roll the dice and see how this goes, and touch wood, so far it's doing quite well.
This podcast is sponsored by Life Mission Capital, founded by me, Missy Liu, where my life mission is to help busy professionals invest well so they can focus on what matters. All my life, I was taught to study and work hard for my freedom, until one day I realized that unless I let my money work hard for me, I will always be trading my most precious resource, time, for freedom. Since then, we have also been helping our investors passively diversify into more than 1,000 units of recession and inflation-resistant alternative investments, such as multifamily, mobile home parks, short-term rentals, and more. Learn more with our free ebooks at lifemissioncapital.com.
Yeah, that's awesome. So some of the things you mentioned are rich on taxes impact, legal impact, also location. When it comes to investments, we're in the US, which town, which city, which block, all those are critical things. And looking for whether cash flow or appreciations, you picked one of your investments is more appreciation based, like the one in Bentonville. Like in Northwest Arkansas, we both know we've been consistently rated as like top 7 places to live for the last decade. And Bentonville population actually has increased by 20% in the last few years. The median household income has increased from like high 40s, low 50s since 2016 to today in the 85,000 range. And certain areas, zip codes are in the $100,000 minimum household income. So there's a lot of money pouring into here by the Walton family. So you picked a great city, and also looking at where the path of continuous progress is, and that's full appreciation. And that's great. I think those are really great strategies, and kind of taking investments onto your own hand. While I do think there's values of financial advisors, etc., because not everyone knows how to do that to start with, but you took the knowledge to learn and consume, and then start making your own investment decisions by working with a group of people that you trust. So that's awesome. Congratulations to all the progress.
Yeah, thank you. Thank
freedom
you.
that you've been building.
And sometimes you do have to take stock and go, actually, we're building something pretty cool here. It's very easy to get consumed in the day-to-day of your job or family or whatever. But occasionally I do visit with a financial advisor and we take stock, and it's comforting to know that you're financially secure, right? I wouldn't say we're rich, but a very wise man said to me, one of my university lecturers actually back in Australia, I was early to mid-20s, but he said, I've had nothing and I've been rich. So he was a bit of an entrepreneur and sort of rode the roller coaster, so to speak. And he said, I had to learn for myself that despite what I thought, when I had zero money or when I had a lot of money, it really made no difference to how happy I was. And I think when I was growing up, you got some problems, you got some insecurities, you got some personality quirks, whatever. I always thought when we didn't have a mortgage, those things would just disappear. The reality is you are the person you are. I don't think, in my experience, money makes you more or less happy. For some people, it creates more problems. So this whole thing, I think, is just about knowing yourself, doing what makes you comfortable, doing what interests you. But if you're internally messed up or something's going on, money isn't going to fix it. However, I do like the comfort of, if the car needs a $3,000 repair, we don't need to worry about it. Right? And everyone's not in that scenario. But I think a lot of people do think, especially when they're younger, and I was one of them, that X amount of money makes you happy. I actually don't feel any different to what I did when I was 17 years old. So I've always been, generally speaking, a pretty happy-go-lucky person. My parents were awesome, still are. My mum is just one of the most fantastic people. She's high on life as well, right? So I don't know what I'm really getting at there, but all I want to say to the listeners is if you think money's going to make certain problems go away, it actually doesn't.
Yeah, I would like to second that. I think my husband tried to help me see that perspective sometimes because it's easy when you're in the hustle as an entrepreneur. Sometimes it's easy to be like, I need to get to the next step, whether it's in revenue, whether it's in whatever specific things I'm working on. I just always have the mentality. So it helps to have someone else like my husband to balance it out. Like, remember, like, it's not going to change. In fact, I believe there's research about like what income would you be happy? Like, there is a middle ground, like a good, I think it was like 50 or 60, between 50 and 100,000 per year. And so it's interesting. Like, when you're super poor, your problems can be exacerbated. And when you're super rich, it can be as well. But it comes down to what your mindset and mentality is. And
Yeah.
I know we're not sure on the topic of talking about how to teach your kids in that space. We don't have kids yet, but I'm very passionate about kids' financial literacy. And you have kids, and it seems like you grew up in the household that really still the mindset of, live with happiness wherever you go. It's not about where you're, who you're with, etc. But like you can be that generator to bring happiness. So when we teach kids, when we have ours, that's something I like to instill in the happiness aspect.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that's very healthy.
it goes along with financial literacy. Like, what's the point of giving them all the money if they don't, if they don't feel happy, right? So
Yeah, or they don't appreciate where it came from. Like, we touched on earlier that my parents were not property investors, and quite the opposite. Like when I was younger, I think I vaguely recall some of my parents' close friends, our neighbours or whatever, had property investments, and I certainly have heard more horror stories than I did positivity, like bad tenant, damage the property, whatever. So if anything, I think my early environment would steer me to not invest. But I don't know. I think you just got to do your reading, educate yourself. There's probably unique circumstances that lead to someone's poor experience or someone's good experience. So I think with our kids, they're certainly aware of the properties we've got, and we don't talk details or anything, but it's also not a gravy train, right? I'm certainly not saying this will be yours one day. Like, I do believe in a certain amount of you got to work for what you get. But of course, we will look after them if they ever fell in hard times. But you probably gather from all this, I'm a pretty big proponent of self-education and getting off your backside and getting involved. And I admire how driven you are in this space, right?
mm-hmm.
So you just got to balance your personality with your risk tolerance, like I said before. But I do think educating the kids is only a good thing in financial literacy and property management, things like that.
Yeah, definitely. With your experiences, whether it's getting those properties, and one thing you mentioned about was the horror stories you heard. I feel there is some truth to it if there is enough people saying it, but it talks about how you manage it. The first few properties, you may or may not have that story. But I think what happens is when you start to scale bigger and when you try to do that on your own, you'll experience burnout. You'll eventually run into not so good residents. You'll eventually run into issues. So it's about having the teams, the partners, and tools at your disposal to help you with that. Now, speaking of partners, I know that you and your family have been in the US for a few years, and you have a incredibly demanding job that even though you try to have a work-life balance, I'm sure at times it's challenging. So how do you look at investment along on top of your job that's already demanding and a family?
Yeah, this might sound a little bit repetitive to something I said earlier, but I err on the side of more pooled maintenance. So POAs, HOAs, just my lifestyle suits units and townhouses for that reason. If I have to call up and chase guys to mow lawns and stuff like that, it's just not going to work for me. So what works for me and has worked historically is something that is extremely low touch. I could probably make a little bit more money out of these things, certainly, and from a revenue perspective, month on month. I could look for a different property management company, save a couple of %. I could look at other things that are absolute bargains, but they're houses. But if you can't maintain it, it's not going to go well. And I've had a pretty simple kind of landlord philosophy since the start, which is I never get greedy on rent. I can probably get more, but The good example, our Florida, our first property, which we've still got there near Animal Kingdom, it was probably 2 years ago, but the property manager said, look, the tenant really wants to stay, but she's a single mum. She's a student at University of Central Florida. She's asked, would you not put up the rent? You can get more. And I'm like, absolutely. Like, I'm just a big one for kind of taking care of people. So anyway, I don't get greedy on rent. And then she's still there, like 2 years later, and they put the rent up and now she's fine. But where she was at the time, she needed something. So I never get greedy on rent, and I just repair things as soon as they break, pretty much no questions asked. What I've found is that, well, I've never had an issue getting tenants because property managers, and to be fair, I've never changed them. All three investments, the property manager I started with, I've still got. So when we've got someone looking, we've got tenants looking, I'm pretty sure the property manager says, the landlord will repair things, they'll give you a good deal on rent. So we
Really
get tenants
fast.
in like that and have never had an issue. So I don't know whether that's our work or a bit of good luck, but I just got a couple of very simple principles there. And a few of my friends would say, you can get more rent than that. And I'm like, maybe. But, you know, I think our current tenants in all three have been there for more than 2 years. And that's pretty remarkable. The one here in Bentonville, they've been in since May 2020. So we're going on 2.5 years now, right?
Yeah. Part of the things about investing in real estate and with your investments made from a few years ago, we did catch on kind of this inflation hedge with real estate. So unless you refinance, there should be a fairly big margin for cash flows, and that can help you afford the property management aspect. You know, they do, if it's a single family, it's common for them to take on 10% of the fees. And if you have a good tenant, they're really not doing much. But the thing is, like, when the tenant breaks something, like, do you really want to really like spend the mental energy to figure out like who to hire and how to hire and double checking their work, etc. So there's definitely value in the low touch process. I think there's a fun balance between focus on what you're good at and let people handle everything else, and versus just do everything on your own. So definitely.
Yeah, and I can see it changing, Macy. Like if I semi-retire in 5 years or something, I'm pretty sure I will be happy to bank the extra money at that point and manage that property myself. But back to the original question, I don't think I could do that well working full-time, 2 teenage kids, etc. So, you know, it's been 25 years in retail, like you said, and we've been property investing for 12 years now. Things change, life stages, things like that. So it's just, you have to reassess it at the time and do what's right to enable you to do your best where you want to do best, whether that's your job or your property portfolio. So it's never one or the other. It's kind of like, it depends on life stage, I would say.
It does. A few days ago, I was talking to a neurosurgeon from Ethiopia originally and she's, done a few decades of neurosurgeon, and now she flips houses on the side for fun. But at the time, she didn't have the bandwidth or the expertise or the desire to do that. And so, but
that's
when
awesome.
She retired, she did. So, but anyways, moving to kind of the latter part of the podcast here, maybe walk us through all the investment you made, the best and the worst investment, maybe real estate related or not, it doesn't matter. And then a few other questions in the show.
Sure. Well, I would say we've been fortunate with property. The house we kept in Sydney, I never really viewed it as an investment, but it wasn't the worst investment. It was probably the worst experience. We had friends in there, which was great because we could shoehorn them right in with almost a handshake agreement without leases. But when plumbing would break, we're on the other side of the world and I wouldn't get their email till the following day. And I was more hands-on there. And as you know, that's not my jam. So that was fine because it was our original primary residence. So it was fine financially, but just from an experience perspective, it wasn't great. The unit we've got in Australia has been pretty good. So I would say the best has been the townhouse in Bentonville. It was our most expensive investment, $494K we spent on that. So you got to think, right? 10 years earlier, I was having heart failure over sending $48,000 to the other side of the world.
Big difference.
And here I am, here we are, my wife and I, dropping 494. And I'm just like, this is, at the time, it was kind of kind of a hold your breath moment. But I think we just trusted ourselves and trusted the area. And like I said, where the Walmart home office was going in relation to the Bentonville Square and things like that. And everything's a risk. You've got to weigh up the downside, but that's done very, very well for us. And then probably the worst, for multiple reasons, was the managed fund I just pulled out of to put our money into some whiskey barrels. It wasn't a ton of money, but actually I did lose $5,000 on crypto pretty quickly. That wasn't good either, but I would say this managed fund was not interesting to me. I didn't understand it. It went up initially, then it's, kind of went backwards. So I lost 20% on this managed fund in probably 18 months, 2 years. And I would say that was our worst because it wasn't that interesting. I didn't know what was going on. And it's like, hey, it's my money, my choice. So we pulled it out. So hopefully the whiskey investment ends up being okay in 4 or 6 years' time. We'll see. But at least I'm interested in it.
Yeah, I think you have a good portfolio with, investing for some appreciations with physical assets and kind of, I wouldn't 100% got hobby investing, but there is definitely a hobby aspect to it with the whiskey, and then you got some managed funds. So the diversification seems great. Something else that I do to invest outside Arkansas as well, just to have some geographic diversification, is through some positions, just to make it a little bit more diverse, because geographic diversification is one of the big things in real estate. Yeah. Great.
Yeah, I think we're well and truly in that bucket. It's Florida, Bentonville, Canberra in Australia.
Very diverse.
Yeah, it's good, So that was not intentional at the time, but like one by one, we've kind of just added them. And I'm a big Tennessee Titans fan, as you said in the opening, and I've been looking at properties in Nashville for a long time. But to your point about risk tolerance and things like that, I've just always thought it was too expensive. They are actually coming down a little bit now, so the market's softening there. And I go to Nashville like 3 or 4 times a year for Titans games or work or something. So I'm there a lot. I've got to know the neighborhoods quite well. I know where I look. So I'll probably lean into something there next. And we also actually, I left this out, but a neighbor of mine, we went 50-50 just in a couple of lots of land up here in Bella Vista. And we'll eventually put some kind of mountain biking cabins on them. It's right on the trails. But
oh, that sounds exciting.
Yeah, it is. It's a much more long-term thing. And we're both really busy in our jobs, but we've got the land there now. And in the next 3 or 4 years, we'll probably, set something nice up there, which will be good.
Yeah, that's awesome. And also one thing that you reminded me when you talked about the Titans fan, with your kids growing older, maybe they'll, I don't know, go to college there. As one of the ways people like to do to help kids pay for college is they buy a property, put down payment, basically let the tenant pay for the mortgages and etc. And then by the time the kids graduate, let's say in 15 years, 18 years, they will have the house paid for. That $200,000 or $300,000, $400,000 is essentially the kids' tuitions. So that could be a great way too, or just have the kid being kind of a property manager, teaching them values of lessons in money. Yep.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'd love for them to get their hands dirty one day, or, if they chose to get into it, share some experiences or give my thoughts. But this might sound horrible. We'll always look after them, but I don't want to hand them anything for nothing either, right? Like, I think you got to work for stuff in life. Easy come, easy go, right? So
Definitely.
I might be proven wrong there, but maybe that's just because I'm old school.
Yeah. No, I understand where you're coming from. So definitely. Well, coming to the end of the show, if the listeners want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to connect with you?
Probably over LinkedIn, just Adam Cairns, Cairns, or Adam Cairns on Facebook. Probably LinkedIn, I would say, but also Dusty Dog 41 on Instagram. So
awesome.
It's not the most professional handle ever, but it is what it is.
I think it speaks well to your personality, so I think it's perfect.
So thanks for the time. We had a ball and really good to see you, and like watching what you're doing as well. So I'm sure we can learn off each other. Thanks, Vesey.
Thank you so much, Adam, for recording with us today. I know that this episode was recorded in 2022 and we're not in 2023. But I think some of the things you mentioned are still true today. For example, I think it's very important to understand how much time you have before you get into some of this really active, intense investing, managing tenants and toilets. Whether it's in hiring property managers, investing townhouse, condos, that reduces some of the headaches, or passive investing in the case of group investing, like what we do, helping others passively invest and reduce the risks in that space and make it more passive. So I think it's important to understand your picture, the life you want to live, and the time you have before you dive too deep into one end. And the second thing that I love is you can grow your investment career along with your W-2 career, with your career, moving to be the VP and a Fortune 1 company. And slowly and steadily, you have made small decisions that have continued to grow legacy and freedom for your family. So I love those two things as well. And the third thing is continuous education. Even though you were far away in Australia at the time when you bought your first investment property, you did your education and you leveraged the education that's provided from the experts as well and took that decision to make that investment. And that investment paved the way to help you buy a primary residence and continue to invest from there as well. So like what I always say is don't buy real estate and wait. So hopefully this is helpful and I'm super excited that you came by today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for tuning in to the American Dream Builder and Investor podcast with me, Missy Liu. We hope you enjoy the tips and tricks that others have used to build their American dream and their trinity of freedom. We would love for you to subscribe and leave a rating and a review. You can also find all the episodes and details on lifemissioncapital.com. Until then, let your life mission go wild.